Just a quick thought coming out of the newscast. You heard one of the final stories from during the news was about there's a basketball game tonight. In case you didn't know, it seems to be an important one. But we were 1 point away from having an all Northwestern final. 1 point, and that would have done it. Unfortunately, it was nobody from Idaho. Coming up on 9:07, Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX, News Radio 1310.com. Going to call it 33. The temperature, as I said, it's been ping-ponging around all morning today, but it will be getting warmer as the week progresses, and we may have a little bit of a cool down over the weekend, but nothing that'll be too terribly severe. We spent the last 15 minutes talking with Randy Staples from Idaho Weekly Briefing about what may or may not happen when it comes to the governor. Bills coming across his desk now that legislative session is wrapped up in Boise. We're going to spend a good part of this hour, if not all of it, talking with the House Minority Leader, Matt Erpelding. And he was with us last week as we were getting near the end of session, and he had some insight into what would be happening and some predictions as well. But first of all, I'd like to say welcome back to the show today.
Thanks, Bill. I really appreciate it. What a great opportunity. Twice in a month. It's incredible.
Well, I'm glad you're here, and spread the word in your own party. I'd like to hear from the other side a little bit more often.
Well, we're happy to. Absolutely.
People know what I think. They don't, at this stage of the game, that doesn't change. So we'll get a few other voices on the program.
Sure.
I've got to ask you, from your perspective, being in the minority, obviously when a session wraps up and everybody looks back and does what, for lack of a better term, post-mortem on all of this, there's got to be some things that you wish had been done that didn't get done. And I'm sure every year you look at it that way.
Oh, yeah, there's always stuff that we wish had gotten done that didn't get done, and most of it is usually how to really make the best policy before we jam it down everybody's throat and vote on it. The best example is it sounds like you were talking with Randy about the transportation bill. That one was a really divisive piece of legislation because it addressed some issues, but it left a ton of issues on the table, and it was, essentially an example of Evel Knievel trying to jump the canyon. Made it about halfway, but it fell pretty short.
Was it a lack of, do we need more money, or is it just the fact of the borrowing, that nature of it?
Well, the borrowing piece is a really tough question because, as you know, I voted for the legislation. I voted for the legislation because we have this interstate that is now it's what used to be a rural interstate like you'd have out by Burley, but it's in the middle of a huge developing city. In fact, the largest city in Idaho, and it is dangerous and it is deadly. And so when you start talking about lives and how you're going to fix it, if you look at the gas tax or you look at other ways to fund it, there's just no way to do the expansion needed to save people's lives without taking out a loan. And while I disagree, my major disagreement wasn't that we needed to take out the loan. My major disagreement was when you take out a loan, I don't know about you, but I also try to start putting money away so that someday when that road breaks or that road wears out 10 years from now and we start having maintenance, there's money to fix the potholes and, do other types of basic repairs. And there isn't. Representative Kaufman from your neck of the woods, I think he's going to be with you tomorrow.
Yes.
He had a great piece of legislation earlier this year that addressed the needs of both the local transportation districts and the state highways. And also it addressed the concerns that many people have that if gas reaches a certain price, it becomes unattainable for people across the board, and so this nickel tax would have dropped off when gas reached, I think it was $4 a gallon or $3.75 a gallon. And what he was trying to address was, listen, we've got long-term maintenance needs. We have some real serious issues in our transportation and our infrastructure with bridges and roads, particularly in the local jurisdictions. We've got to have a conversation about how to fix it. He couldn't even get that out of committee. I mean, talk about falling on dead ears. And that committee is made up largely of Canyon County legislators who proceeded to ram through a bill that will fix their road on a massive loan, but refused to vote for anything that would fund major repairs in the Magic Valley, in the I-15 corridor, any of those, or even for that matter, the I-90 corridor.
Well, I think it makes some of us nervous too because these Garvey bonds. The notion is you pay the money back when you get a particular share of the federal budget, but there are a lot of rumblings with the new administration in Washington about cutting certain areas of that budget, and we're going to potentially see things go away, revenue sharing, and the other types of things. Well, they call it now block grant. But if we get into a particular period in the future where somebody stops sending a check every year from Washington for highway maintenance and the like, how do you pay it back?
Oh my goodness, Bill, that's an incredible question. It's a difficult question. I will say that one thing that the Trump's administration is agitating for is $1 trillion in infrastructure investment. I don't even know how you pay for that off the top, but I will say that I think Garvey money, future highway maintenance funds money, is probably the most stable of any source in the Trump administration in terms of the things they're looking at cutting. So I wasn't as worried about that. I will point out, though, that you had Democrats across the Magic Valley that were also opposed to this bill, and so it even split our caucus because if you represent the Treasure Valley, you're looking at this interstate and thinking, man, people are dying on this road, and it has potholes that a Geo Metro could fall into. But meanwhile, Representative Sally Toon and Senator Michelle Stennant basically said, absolutely not. If you're not going to create a funding transportation bill that does something for all parts of the state, we're not with you. And I thought that they took a real principled step in their leadership in voting against the legislation. And that was after I begged them to vote for it. So it was really an interesting way that it shook out. But to kind of come back around to your question about the agitators in the Trump administration talking about federal highway funds. Our federal delegation is made up basically of on the congressional side, a policymaker and a bomb thrower. And I know that Representative Mike Simpson would work super hard to ensure that we continue to receive federal funds, as every other state should, with regard to transportation, maintenance, and infrastructure, particularly on interstates in the state of Idaho. And I'm not sure what the other representative would do. He would probably throw a bomb and then take credit for killing something.
I didn't see that. When Representative Labrador actually spoke to your body a few weeks back, it seemed to me he was rather level-headed.
He was rather level-headed, but then he got on Twitter with Trump last week and demonstrated that he may not be.
It's 9:14. Matt Erpelding is our guest on Top Story this morning. Bill Colley with you as well on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. We're at 32. On this business of road repairs, I drove the back way from King Hill to Mountain Home on Saturday.
Oh.
I saw a washout at one particular point, and I think what you bring up, and I drove Route 30 going east a few weeks back out to Burley, and I've seen those big potholes, and some of those, if you're driving at night, you don't even see them. I think there is some legitimate concern. Sure, we need to fix I-84 in certain spots, but that if we don't get the repairs done on some of these secondary roads, there's no way the milk truck is going to get through.
We need to stop having conversations about how simple it would be to get the feds out of our business, and that the government is bloated and people are not doing their job. The reality is that there is not currently enough money in the system to fix the types of roads you're talking about. And until we get to a place where we're willing to talk about revenue and how we get that revenue and how we make it fair so that, the person who lives in Filer and has to drive to Twin Falls for work, or the person who lives, somewhere out of town and has to drive, how they don't just take it right in the shorts when you look at gas fees or registration fees. We've got to find a fair and equitable way to fund our transportation system. And I will tell you this, we've also got to stop sucking on the federal teat, because the more we are dependent upon the federal government, which we are a dependent state, the less willing we are to actually take matters into our own hands and do our job.
I was working, 25, 30 years ago in upstate New York, and there was a huge debate in the legislature there about something called a dedicated highway fund that would be there every year for road repairs. The problem was it didn't get anywhere because they had promised, when they had a toll road built in the 1950s on Route 90, And I used to have to work in Buffalo and drive through town and throw quarters into baskets on some of the feeder roads. There,
How fast could you do it at? I mean, what pace were you going by?
you couldn't do it without slowing down to about 5 miles per hour.
Oh.
You'd miss otherwise. Um, the thing is that money had been promised for highway repairs, and then it had been robbed, if you will, for lack of a better word, to pay for other issues. And I think that there's a notion that any state that adopts a dedicated highway fund has to have an ironclad agreement that you can't reach in and take the money out for other purposes. Number one, and number two is that something that would work here.
That's a great question. The bill, we already have that here. And actually, what the legislature is trying to do is pillage the general fund because they're unwilling to fully invest in the dedicated highway fund. Our Constitution essentially reads that anything raised from gas tax or registration fees must be used for the maintenance of our highway systems in Idaho. And generally speaking, the distribution model is a 60-40 split to the locals and to the state. And but the problem is, I came to Idaho in 1993. It's a long story, but I fell in love with the Orange Track in Holt Arena when I was in high school, and I ultimately came to Idaho State to go to college because of that Orange Track. And I'll tell you, we haven't raised the gas tax other than one time since 1997, which I at that point in time had already finished college. And so when you don't have a plan to adjust for inflation and adjust for growth, you end up with a massive deficit, which is what we have now. So what the legislature has been trying to do is they've been trying to seed this false narrative that the gas tax is a dying tax and that there's not going to be enough money in the future. And so now what we need to do is pillage the education fund for roads. So it's the exact opposite of what you experienced in your past life before you came to Idaho, because now people are robbing the education fund and the health and welfare fund in order to fix roads. And once you start creating those types of budget competitions, I think it's a lose-lose for Idaho.
We're speaking with Matt Erpelding. He's the House Minority Leader in Boise, and we've got a short break coming up in about 30 seconds. He's going to stick around with us, and we're going to talk about a couple of other topics too as well this morning, including grocery tax and also unemployment insurance tax. That one may have been a little bit under the radar of some of the news media in this state, but it's going to have a big impact. We'll talk about that in just a short while. In the meantime, short break coming up. We're at 33 at 9:20. Also wanted to mention I had a fellow do some measurements last week. I've been participating in the total body transformation system. The size of my neck has dropped 4 inches since the middle of September. I haven't had a neck this size since I think I was a college student 35 years ago. The system was developed by a company that's been in business over 20 years. It has an A-plus rating from the Better Business Bureau. You can lose 6 times more fat and 8 times more weight than normal results from diet and exercise alone. The meal replacement plan is about the same as what you pay for groceries currently and often healthier than the groceries that you're eating. You can have a healthy amount of calories. Also wanted to mention as well, you can learn more by contacting Don Chandler. Don's also a customer. His telephone number is 208-731-3560, 208-731-3560. We've got 32 and 22 minutes after 9 o'clock. You're listening to Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Our guest during this hour of the program is Matt Erpelding. He is the House Minority Leader in Boise, giving us the perspective from the Democrats on the recently wrapped up state legislative session. And I do want to point out in the next half hour, if you'd like, we're going to open up the telephones and you can perhaps ask the minority leader a question and or offer a comment. Try to keep the comment part of it brief, obviously. Wanted to point out, too, as well, we had a discussion with Randy Staples in the last half hour about the grocery tax, which you have legislators who've decided it's time to remove it, but you've got a governor who has already warned he's hostile to the idea of removing it. Representative, what's your take? What's he going to do?
Well, I wish I could read Governor Otter's mind. I would be a much more successful politician. However, I voted for the grocery tax, and I voted to eliminate the grocery tax. And I feel very strongly that if you're going to offer tax relief to Idahoans, it should benefit everyone. And this is one of those taxes that affects people on the borders disproportionately. And you have working Idahoans who, can use this. It's money that can be in their pocket right away instead of through the credit on the back end. Now, the governor has said he's opposed to it, and he said he's opposed to it because of budgetary constraints, and he does have a very, very valid point. So, I'm not sure what he's going to do. He's going to have to be the fiscal conservative in the room if he's really thinking that we don't have the resources to make this type of a choice. It's odd, though, because he would have supported a $55 or $60 million income tax cut, which was completely irresponsible, would not have really helped most working Idahoans. I mean, we've talked about this before. If my wife and I make $100,000 together, and then we take our adjusted gross income, and we take out our house and all that, and I think we're probably lucky if we make that much. But then when it all shakes out, our taxable income in Idaho is like $40,000. And the tax cut that they were running on income tax would have saved us like $29, which isn't even enough to fill the gas in my Subaru. Whereas a grocery tax credit relief, that'll help everybody. So, it's kind of a forked tongue if he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth. He wants income tax for the wealthiest Idahoans, but he doesn't want to do a grocery tax because somehow it's bad for our budget. Doesn't make any sense to me.
I heard a great line. You were on the show with us last week, and the next day I talked to an area Republican and said, "Did you get a chance to hear the minority leader?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "What was your take?" And he said, "He blames Republicans for everything." And
He said that? Well,
one of our leading Republicans said that.
That's funny. That is pretty funny, although a supermajority does kind of warrant being blamed for everything. So,
I was going to say it does go both ways, though, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's Representative Harkin. He's a classic one who blames anything that ever happens that is outside of the realm of decency. He blames it on Democrats. So I'm not in the same boat as him. I think if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen because, both sides are to be blamed for many of our problems. And unless we're able to come to the middle and have some real serious conversations about what's best, then
it does
what's
seem
the point?
It does seem though that you're trying to at least move your caucus in a direction that would be much more familiar to Democrats who maybe used to vote for people like Scoop Jackson when he was representing a neighboring state. Because we talked last week, the social issues really didn't come up much this session, and it was all really a focus primarily on just taxing and spending.
Yeah, I think that what my goal is for the caucus is that we recognize that, this idea that you're not, that Democrats aren't fiscally conservative. I mean, I don't know about you, but I own a house. I have no credit card debt. I really don't want credit card debt. And I've got a little bit of student loans left. But other than that, I'm trying to save any penny I have in order to help further my family and further my life. And I think that that's how I view government is, we need to do the very best we can. And if it's a last resort, we take out a loan. But otherwise, we need to do what we can with what we have. But somewhere along the way, Democrats got branded in a way that I think is inaccurate, particularly for Idaho Democrats. I mean, let's think back to some of the great Idaho Democrats. They were very strong fiscal hawks. They supported education. They did what they could. I mean, Governor Evans is famous for ensuring that our education system and our transportation system remained intact during a major recession in the 80s. Governor Andrus was responsible for so much that we have in terms of education, including kindergarten. And then I think another thing that Governor Andrus is really famous for that people forget is he parked state patrol vehicles on the train tracks to stop nuclear waste from coming to Idaho. And I'm with him. I agree that we need to have a strong economy, but not at the expense of our aquifer and not at the expense of our environment. And somewhere along the way, we lost track of that, and we're going to get back to it.
Is there? We've got about a minute before the next break, and then we're going to get back to a couple of other legislative issues. But and can you sum it up in a minute? Is there somebody in your party out there right now who's of the same stature as those individuals who might be able to turn around some of the losses your party has seen?
I don't. I think there's a lot of really strong Democrats right now. I mean, your valley has consistently sent fiscally responsible, socially responsible Democrats to the legislature, whether it be Representative Toon, whether it be former House Minority Leader Wendy Jaquit, and current Senate Minority Leader Michelle Stennett. Those are folks who work really hard and cross the aisle and have represented Democrats and continue to represent Democrats in a really strong fashion. I will also point this out, Bill. Democrats were the only ones who proposed paying off debt this year. We had a piece of legislation that would have ensured that we paid off that correctional institution that we gave to the, what were they called, CCA, Corrections Corporation of America. So as you know, in 1999, we built a prison, gave it to this private prison company, and took a massive loan that we've been paying $5 million a year out of the general fund to support the debt maintenance on that. $30 million bucks. If we'd paid that down this year, we'd have freed $5 million a year, and that could have done a lot of things in terms of education and even transportation. So when we talk about fiscal conservatism, it's really unfortunate that one party tries to own it, but then their votes don't indicate that.
We've got more coming up with Matt Erpelding. He's the Minority Leader of the Idaho House of Representatives. It's 9:30. Short break, and then we've got another half hour ahead. Also, some of your telephone calls, if you're so inclined to, as well. Matt Erpelding is the leader of the Democrats in the Idaho House of Representatives, Minority Leader, joining us this week, giving us his rundown of the recently concluded legislative session. It's 9:34, and we're at 34. Bill Cawley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. And off air, I've been talking to the representative about the unemployment insurance tax, which was a big issue. I don't know that it got a lot of attention in media when it comes to some of the other issues that were dominating discussion about this legislative session. Not a lot of people were happy when this thing, there was very little change on this from what I can see.
Yeah, there were, the unemployment insurance tax, when it went down because the establishment decided that they weren't getting what they wanted, so they waylaid that bill on general orders and added a bunch of other tax cuts. And so folks that had voted for the grocery tax basically looked at it and said, how can you take the unemployment insurance tax, which came over as a clean bill and would have helped businesses across the state without impacting the general fund? So this is it's basically a siloized fund that employers pay into to ensure there's enough money for unemployment insurance. Well, it blows my mind that we couldn't get a clean bill out of the House to help businesses. Instead, the establishment Republicans were all over the place on it. They were kicking it over to general orders. They wanted to attach that income tax back to it. It was really pretty difficult to watch.
It's going to, from what I hear, the fallout is that the business community was not pleased, and generally you would think that they'd have a lot more input with the Republican Party because we tend to traditionally think of that there's an allied relationship there.
Well, that's what we call a false truth. There's an allied relationship on both sides. In this particular case, there were enough votes to get that bill, Democrats and Republicans, to get that bill out of the House in an unamended, clean way. But businesses, once the House started pandering over how they were going to send this thing to general orders and tack amendments on it, businesses lost control of their influence of the establishment Republicans, and before you knew it, it was kicked out of the House but died in the Senate. And it died in the Senate because, quite frankly, it was a bill that never should have made it out. that way and had been amended and made a lot of people really upset, and it's an example of when leadership probably oversteps their bounds.
Would is it part of the problem here? Maybe the length of the session. I mean, if we had a longer session, would we be able to address more of these things before they end up dying on the vine, withering on the vine?
Well, I go back and forth on this issue because I feel like the longer the session gets, the worse things that start to pop out of committee drawers, and terrible ideas are like, rising from the dead, and legislatures become the walking dead because we're all tired and overwhelmed and have probably eaten one too many friggin' meatballs at the sessions that we have. And so, when you start getting later and later in session, you, I think, get a group of folks who aren't used to that much pressure. One change that could be made, though, would be for majority leadership, and for that matter, minority leadership, to come together at the beginning of the session and say, these are the issues that we are just going to continue to pound away on until we get the best possible bill. But what you see is the majority leadership, they have a lot of meetings behind closed doors, and in those meetings they make decisions, and it's almost like a parent-child relationship. So they'll make the decisions, and then they'll tell the children, this is the best we could do, you need to vote on it. I find that to be absurd and often question that, because I think that if you're a leader in this building, then all issues need to be on the table. But instead what we have are these bills that show up the second to the last day of the session. People are overwhelmed. They're probably not the best choice for the entire state, but the legislature's told this is the best we could come up with. Well, if this is the best you could come up with, then maybe there needs to be some changes.
And and if we have a couple of big bills that are obviously vetoed, there's no opportunity at this point until next year to really do anything about this.
Right. Unless the governor, there is a perception that the governor could, not veto the grocery tax, but then call a special session for us to actually deal with transportation appropriately, and then he could veto the bill that came out of the House and the Senate on transportation. If I was the governor, that would be one option that I'd be looking at, because the governor can call a special session, the governor can say what the topic is, and the governor can kind of drive that. And the transportation bill that passed, while good for the Treasure Valley, Representative Toon said it best, this does nothing for the Wood River Valley, and it's not going to help the Magic Valley, and she's right.
We've got more coming up with Matt Erpelding. He's the minority leader in the House of Representatives in Idaho. About 20 minutes left in our program. We're at 35. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. Also going to get a reaction from the House Minority Leader in just a moment about perhaps some of his thoughts about some of his fellow legislators, including many of those on the other side of the aisle. That's on the way. Our guest joining us this morning in hour number 2 of the program on Top Story is Matt Erpelding. He is the House Minority Leader in the Idaho House of Representatives. He leads the Democrats, that caucus, that side of the House. It's coming up on 9:42. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story. Right now we're at 35, and you're listening to News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. Representative, there was something I was telling you about in one of the breaks this morning when Governor Otter was holding a Capitol for a day session here in Twin Falls County. He got to talking a little bit about the faith healing bill that had been proposed, and this is an issue that's not gone away and will be with us, I'm sure, for a long time. But he tried to explain to the people who were in the room that he was not envious of anybody in the legislature, because he said somebody's got to lose on a bill like this. Somebody's got to lose in a sense that we either, they lose on religious liberty grounds or they lose from the other side, from the medical grounds. There are bills like that come up, and I think sometimes there's a lot of soul searching that goes on and probably a lot of stress for legislators when they're dealing with one of those issues.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Governor Otter he is correct. The faith healing bill, which was a Senate bill, so it really never came over to the House side all that much, but talk about a First Amendment rights issue, religious freedom, but at the same time, child welfare. issue, and the safety of the children inside of a home, regardless of their faith. It really never came over to the House, so I never had to spend much time working on the issue directly. However, the bigger issue that I think came out of the whole constitutional argument was the con and Article 5 and kind of creating a nuclear option with our Constitution. And I was very happy. We were gearing up on the House side, but we were very happy to see it defeated in the Senate, because opening our Constitution, whether you're on the right or the left, opening up our Constitution using the nuclear option, which is what I've been referring to Article 5 as, was a bad idea. And so I was very glad to see that one defeated, because just the damage that we could do to our country by tinkering with the Constitution right now would be off the charts.
We had talked about that just briefly last week, that there are sometimes moments when you see the two leading parties on the same page on something, and it raises a question. We have Representative Kaufman in studio tomorrow. I was joking with one of our fellow Republicans about his visit, and I said, I think if you're talking about Republicans in the legislature and you've got these different factions, there were two at one point, now there seems to be three with a Freedom Caucus coming along, but that Representative Kaufman would be described, and I think the best word I could find was level. That is,
Yeah.
He's very thoughtful. He takes some time to really put some. You look across that aisle and you do see some people over there, I'm sure, that you admire.
Oh, yeah. Representative Kaufman and I have a great relationship. We were elected for the first time the same year. We came into the session the same year, and we have kind of grown. We've learned this building together. I would say that Clark is one of my folks who I go to if I have a real concern, because I know he's going to address it in a way that does what's best for Idaho. I've always been impressed with him.
Then I look at Representative Zollinger, who's one of the two men who's talking about this Freedom Caucus, and nobody really knows exactly what that's going to be yet. Do you have any clue?
I don't. I think it's really interesting that the Freedom Caucus seems to be splitting from the Liberty Caucus, which seems to be splitting from the establishment. So talk about just like fractures in the Republican Party. I will say one thing about Representative Zollinger. He also seems very level-headed. He is a person who I've watched this year, and we've voted together a number of times. And while other members of that wing of the conservative arm of the Republican Party were trying to paint themselves in the light of we are victims, we are mistreated down here, Representative Zollinger never did that. Not one time. He may have disagreed with process, he may have been pushing back, but he never once took the tact that I think many of the others did, which was we're victims in this building.
Now, the media, and this is from my own experience before I was doing talk radio, I spent a lot of years in news management, as well as even when I was much younger out on the street, just as a general assignment reporter and then a beat reporter. We tend to chase the biggest firestorms. There was a lot of that contentious, I guess that's probably a good word to use it, infighting going on in the Republican side of the caucus this year. And that's what garnered a lot of media attention. Did we miss anything because of that perhaps we should have seen?
Yeah, I think what you missed was that the minority caucus were actually pushing legislation forward that really was designed to help and support Idaho, was fiscally responsible, and helped garner that middle ground. Like I said, we put forward a proposal to pay off our debt on that darn prison that we mistakenly got into a deal with the Corrections Corporation of America, which ultimately we had to kick out of the state because they created a gladiator school. We put forward legislation that would have addressed rural teacher shortages, and we figured out a way to pay for it without having to, make any major changes other than paying off our debt. And so while they were fighting and having personality fights, we were out really trying to garner support across the board. We had bipartisan support for the rural teachers proposal. We had bipartisan support for the loan forgiveness, or for the Corrections Corporation of America debt payment. We were leaders on invasive species, and so while the Republicans were basically just kicking each other in the chops, we were actually doing the business of the state. I think one of the last things we did that I'm really proud of was, in addition to working on transportation, we secured money for what we call Safe Routes to Schools, which is basically keeping little kids and bikes off the roads so that people don't get hit by cars. And when you talk about safety, that's something that is of the utmost importance in Idaho. We want to have roads that aren't clogged up with pedestrians and bikes, especially in school zones.
You mentioned some of the names of well-known figures earlier when you mentioned Governor Andrus and Evans, and if you look back at Frank Church and then even William Borah, who was really just an independent,
Mm-hmm.
the state has a very strong history of people coming up from different parties and becoming well-known figures. On the other hand, I was in February at a Lincoln Day dinner where I heard a figure from the Republicans that 84.5% of all elective offices in Idaho are now controlled or held by the Republican Party. From your perspective, what isn't resonating with the public from your side? Where have you failed to get a message across that you're a good alternative, or that you would be a respectable alternative, or even a successful alternative?
I think shifts in demographics have occurred, and I also think that the National Party is sometimes a gigantic boat anchor for us. Because when you look at what's happening at the national level, if you're not a fully engaged and discerning voter, you think that translates directly to where you're at in your own state. And so what we've been really working on as a state party and as state leaders is to really point out that just like sometimes we're not happy with the National Republican Party and what the National Republican Party is. Look to your local representatives, look who your choices are, and get engaged at that level, because right now, as we increasingly see a shift back to states' rights, the states have the best opportunity to make the best investments in our people. And the shifts in demographics that occurred, honestly, I'm part of a generation that I had to travel for work. I was making money in order to save money to buy my first home, and so still to this day, I'm not 100% sure what happened in the 90s, because when I came to Idaho, it was a 50-50 split in the Senate, and boy, was there some good policy passed back then. And now we continue to see a trend away from moderation toward these radicals like the Liberty Caucus or the Freedom Caucus.
It's coming up on, we're at 9:50, we'll call it. It's 34. Our guest is, of course, the minority leader of the State House of Representatives in Idaho, Matt Erpelding, and Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. When I mentioned Bora, the thing I remember about the history of reading about him is that he was a constant thorn in the side to Franklin Roosevelt, and that independence does sell well in places like Idaho, I'm sure. And number two, I was a Democrat for 14 years of my young life. And then, to borrow that line from Ronald Reagan, the party left me. As a Roman Catholic, I couldn't support certain issues when it came to
Sure.
a pro-life stance. And my parents had worked in factories. My dad had been a district rep with the IBEW at one time. And looking back on what they believed in, they were very conservative people who just happened to feel that the party represented working men and women. And there seems to have been a disconnect that's gone on here, especially with social issues.
And that's part of the reason I'm on your show. Is the problem is that both sides don't talk. I really want to change that. There are always going to be differences on social issues, and much of that diversion revolves around changing communities in the United States. But the reality is when you're looking around and deciding where you want to plant your flag, do you want to plant your flag in folks who are committed to investing in education, committed to doing the best thing for transportation and infrastructure and driving our economy forward, or do you want to plant your flag with folks who are carrying ridiculous social issue bills? And quite frankly, I don't really want to get involved in social issues because I don't think that the government really should be delving into social issues. Just stay out of it. That's my libertarian streak that comes out. But what we should be doing is ensuring that we have the resources we need to create a better and stronger, more prosperous Idaho.
I look back at my own father who and when I was a boy, there were two really bad words you could say in our house, and that was Richard Nixon. And even my mother, who was a registered Republican, also felt the same way. But by 1980, it was my dad didn't ever talk much about who he voted for, but it was obvious he voted for Ronald Reagan. So there had been a huge change that seems to have taken place from about 1968 onward, where a lot of these one-time Democrats just simply threw in the towel.
Well, that didn't happen in Idaho because at that time Governor Andrus was in the 70s. Governor Andrus was doing great things for Idaho, and then all of the 80s, Governor Evans did great things for Idaho, and you had a much different split. So back then, maybe Idaho's a lag state, but what you had back then were two really fiscally responsible, education-focused leaders who also had a flair for hunting and fishing and doing all the things that we as Idahoans really care about. And I think that message is, and that is who I really align with when I think of myself as an Idaho Democrat, is these guys who have a history and are famous for having done great things for Idaho.
But again, that's true. They were a type of Democrats that in many parts of the country wouldn't be recognizable today. There's that the party wouldn't elect them or even nominate them.
Well, the saying goes that Frank Church and Joe Biden were super close, and I also am probably most aligned with good old Joe Biden, who I just think is an incredible leader, and I think that when you talk about folks who present things to your listeners as an either or you can't have this and you can't have this, well, you can have strong, positive, clean water, clean air, and you can have an economy that works. And I think Twin Falls is the best example of that. You've got incredible value-added food processing going on and without environmental impact going on at the same time. You've got dairy producers in your neighborhood, in your neck of the woods, that are working super hard to provide the resources, the milk, the cheese, everything to our consumers, and they're trying to do it in the most environmentally safe and most environmentally sustainable ways that they can do it. And so somewhere along the way, we got caught up in this, you can't have this if you want this, and that simply isn't true. Governor Andrus, Governor Evans, Representative Stallings, these guys are the epitome of that, and that's what we need to get back to.
You referenced that the New York Times, of course, has a big story today about Twin Falls and the local economy really going against the trend of what we see in rural America. And I think it was Bloomberg last week focused on Utah, which the culture is very similar, and how this part of the country definitely it is not what you would say. Well, it's not like coal country back east by any means.
No, this is a sustainable industry that we have here. Food processing, value-added agriculture, that's a sustainable industry. That's what this country is going to need moving forward. The coal industry, everybody admits that the coal industry is not being slowed down or hampered by environmental regulations. The coal industry is being beaten by natural gas, and natural gas is something that I'm really proud of, that Democrats were responsible for creating incredible reforms in how we regulate natural gas and oil and well drilling in Idaho, and we did it in a couple of ways. We made sure that there's a path forward for the industry so the industry can continue to drill in southwest Idaho. We made sure that the property rights and owners in that area are protected, and we made sure that we protected our water and our air. And that is what we should be talking about. What are the renewable sources that we can do moving forward? I mean, just west of you there in Twin Falls, you've got a brand new solar facility that just went up. And we know that solar employs more jobs than natural gas and coal combined. And if there's one thing Idaho has, it's a ton of sun.
Yeah.
So I
Not
think that
lately, but I do agree.
yeah, and so I think that when we start talking about what we can do to advance our rural economies, Twin Falls is a role model for that. I think that as solar comes more on board and does more for our environment, Hagerman is going to benefit from that. Mountain Home is going to benefit from that, and then certainly with natural gas being cleaner than coal and already having a direct line of Idaho natural gas to a peaker plant for Idaho Power, we're talking about solutions that are going to continue to help our state grow.
Well, Representative Matt Erpelton, we want to thank you for joining us again this week, and we'll try to see if Clark Kaufman can say a couple of nice things about you tomorrow.
Well, you tell Clark hello for me. He's a great man. He does great work.
Will do, and we'll talk soon.
All right, thanks.
All right, take care. Matt Erpelton is the minority leader of the Idaho House of Representatives, giving us a rundown today on the close of session last week and some of what he expects, and also kind of breaking down where his party may have some strengths and where it may have gone off the rails over the years. As I said, tomorrow, Clark Kaufman joins us in studio just after the 9 o'clock news. Also, Steve Millington will be by at 8:30 tomorrow morning. And God willing, if the creek don't rise, they'll allow me to come back and do this all over again tomorrow morning between 8 and 10 o'clock. Rush Limbaugh is up next following the news from Fox at 10 o'clock.